if we start off, after 40 plus years, you are endorsing a Democrat for the first time. Tell me about the decision to back Biden.
Yeah, it wasn't an easy one. As you can imagine, first, you know, for those 44 ensuing years since I last voted for a Democrat, 1976, for Jimmy Carter. And why? Because Jimmy Carter was the born again candidate. He was unapologetically evangelical. He espoused the deepest of Christian faith and convictions. And I thought that would be good for our country. And I still believe it was. Although I would become a critic of both him and the Democratic Party over the next few decades. And then with time, I say with great regret, I became at times more of a faithful Republican than a faithful Christian. And after a while, it seemed the two were synonymous. That if I was to be Christian in my political engagement, that meant to be Republican at the same time. And it really took the Trump presidency, although not exclusively so, for me to see that differently and to evaluate it differently. And I came to the conclusion that while the Republican Party and eventually Donald Trump came to promote the sort of premier concerns of evangelicals like me, that is, anti-abortion policies, uh, religious liberty guarantees, suspicions about gay rights and same-sex marriage and so forth. At the same time, all the other concerns, and in some ways more important concerns, were diminishing. The party and the administration were becoming more narrow. And let's take, for example, treatment of the stranger, the foreigner, the immigrant among us became extremely hostile and toxic. So those things caused me to look differently. A personal encounter with Donald Trump caused me to exercise great doubt about him. And eventually I came to the conclusion that Joe Biden and the Democratic Party, even though not perfect when it comes to Christian sensibilities, was the better choice.
Now, we've heard President Trump describe his own diagnosis of COVID-19 as a blessing from God. How important do you think Christianity is when it comes to winning the White House?
Well, sadly, here in this country, it's become a great advantage for a politician to co-opt religion in general, but specifically evangelical Christianity. And there was a deal struck with Mr. Trump between my colleagues, many of whom I worked very close with for 30 plus years, who told me privately, we sat together, in fact, at the Republican National Convention in Cleveland in 2016, where Donald Trump would be nominated as the party's candidate for president. And many of them told me. One said he was holding his nose because of the foul odor that Mr. Trump emitted, but he was going to vote for him anyway and back him. Another said he was going to vomit after he cast his ballot, but he thought it was worth it because Trump would get done what we've needed to get done for so long. Well, Donald Trump saw that. He knew that. If he gave us what we demanded, we would give him what he demanded, which was full and unchallenged support. And it became a great advantage for him when 81% of American evangelicals cast their vote for him. It's a tremendous advantage for any politician. So we have to be very wary of when politicians attempt to co-opt Christian faith, to use it and exploit it. That will always be a temptation for us to give into it. It will always be a device that they reach for on either side, Democrat or Republican, and we must be very, very guarded about that.
You recently blogged about abortion and its politicization. Why do you think it continues to be such an important issue on both sides to Americans?
Well, of course, playing on people's emotions is very important in any political enterprise, any campaign. I've had more than one political operative tell me that, you know, the most effective tools they have are fear and anger. So anything that will gin up fear and anger, in other words, very charged emotions, is very good for voter turnout, to get people to the polls and casting their votes. And abortion is one of the most volatile and emotionally charged topics in American society. People feel very, very passionately on both sides. Women, of course, are fearful that their options in an unplanned, unwelcome pregnancy will be eliminated. On the other side is the anger over disrespect for human life. So, abortion is a good angle for any politician. This is why I now advocate that we get abortion out of the political sphere completely. That the worst people in the world to treat the problem of abortion, no matter how you see it, are politicians, judges, and law enforcement personnel. They are not equipped, and frankly, they are quite craven and cynical when it comes to such sensitive human crises. They will use it. And that's why I now support our Roe v. Wade decision at the Supreme Court, because it removed political actors largely from the abortion question. I think it's a moral issue, and it's something that moral actors should intervene and work with. It's not for political actors.
Are you concerned about the future of Roe v. Wade if Donald Trump is re-elected?
Yes, yes. And that may be a fait accompli already because, of course, his nominee for the empty seat at the Supreme Court likely will be confirmed. And that may set the stage. It may not. The court has surprised both, either side on numerous occasions. No one can predict it, but it looks like the stage is being set for it, which will return everything to the state legislatures. And, Joe Biden has said that he would propose it as a law passed by the Congress, which I see as a good thing because that allows the American people to weigh in on the process. Joe Biden can't decree anything, neither can Donald Trump. We don't have a monarchy, an absolute monarch here. We don't even have a constitutional monarchy. We just have, a legislature and a chief executive. So, that would mean the entire process, the proposal of a bill, its debate in the Congress. The American people get to weigh in all kinds of ways before a president then has to consider whether signing or vetoing it. So there's a big, long process, and that probably should be the way we resolve it. Should it come to the, to Roe v. Wade going down at the court.
Now, clearly, we're all living in very strange times on both sides of the Atlantic. How are the spiritual needs being met in DC of government officials? Is it extremely difficult in terms of ministry currently?
Well, of course, the White House does not have a chaplaincy. There's no chaplain there. Clergy are invited to come. Sadly, in most White House administrations, they are more used than they are sought for counsel and spiritual direction and succor and all the rest. You know, they become political actors. Uh, so I think that the place where true spirituality is fostered in the executive branch, that is the White House and the presidential administration, is really in small groups that meet for private Bible study, prayer, uh, other spiritual exercises, and and that does happen, and it's salutary. It's very good. Uh, there is a chaplaincy at the Congress. There are two chaplains, one for the House of Representatives, one for the Senate. I know both of them personally. They're very good people. They care deeply for souls. They are very loving and gracious people. Again, there are other small groups that meet uh, privately. I know there's a prayer breakfast of senators. There's Bible studies that involve members of Congress. There's a house where various members of Congress live and practice a spiritual community. So, a lot of this happens privately and unofficially, and it's good and it's healthy. Uh, no such thing exists at the Supreme Court, but court members are spiritual people and they discuss spiritual matters and they pursue spiritual exercises. So it is present. Unfortunately, in the time that we're living now, so much of all of this is politicized, highly politicized, and used as a political weapon. And that's regrettable because it diminishes the effect of spiritual ministry and care in all of these realms.
Now, if we talk a little bit about yourself personally at the moment, you're well known as president of the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Institute. Can you tell me about your current work to date?
Yes, what we try to do at the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Institute is use this guy who's over my shoulder as we speak. Very brave, brilliant, young church leader in Nazi-era Germany. Was one of the first voices to speak out courageously against Adolf Hitler and his Third Reich. He would pay for that with his life. He joined the resistance and ultimately the conspiracy to bring down the Hitler government, including assassination plots. He was hanged for that at Flossenburg concentration camp at age 39, but not before he left us a wonderful body of literature, 10,000 pages on Christian ethics. And we use his insights on ethics to help form what we call ethically courageous leadership for our own time and in our own place. And what I like so much about Bonhoeffer is not only that he's very realistic in his assessment of faith and the world and human experience and even politics, but he's equally admired by conservatives and progressives. I once sat in a room full of progressive church leaders here in the United States, and when I mentioned the name Bonhoeffer, everyone literally sat up to attention. The next day, I was with the Trump Evangelical Council at the Trump Hotel in Washington, one of the most conservative groups of religious leaders in the country, and I mentioned Bonhoeffer, and the same response. They all sit up with exactly the same amount of attention. So he can speak to the whole spectrum of religious sensibilities, right, left, political, social, and even theological. So he's really, I think, a voice for our time.
Wonderful. And are you finding it easy to carry on in the current environment in terms of your work within the Institute, or is it just like everyone else that you're doing it from wherever you might be through a computer screen?
We are doing things mostly two-dimensionally, which is very frustrating because, of course, for me, faith, particularly Christian faith, is a highly relational dynamic, and proximity of fellowship is as important as anything else. But we're doing the best we can. In some ways, and I want to be careful how I say this, it's reminiscent of the early church that suffered under persecution and oppression and had to do a lot of its work through correspondence. It's why we have letters, some in hiding, literally sequestered. When I think of the numbers of people I know who are isolating or are quarantined because of the disease, or so many of us who are just simply trying to work safely, I think of the disciples on, the morning of the crucifixion, of the resurrection, who were in hiding. They were sequestered. They were in quarantine. They were isolated and shut away from each other. And so, it gives us a view, as Bonhoeffer called it, from the underside. A lot of people have to live this way in the world, and not just temporarily because of the virus, because of violence, war, fear, persecution, oppression. There's lots of reasons people have to isolate. And now we in the West, particularly in countries like yours and mine, where we enjoy an enormous amount of freedom and prosperity, now we get our turn at learning what so much of the rest of the world must live like regularly.
Yes, that all excellent points. If looking ahead, it's not long now at all. I'll start again because I've got a croak in my throat. Excuse me. Looking ahead, it's not long now until the actual election. As Christians, how can we best pray, do you think, for the US election?
Well, first, I say to my fellow Christians, let's remember how Jesus taught us to pray. He actually instructed us how to pray. And he said, pray like this. And we have the Lord's Prayer, our Father who art in heaven. And it ends, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Well, it doesn't end, but it's punctuated, let's just say, punctuated in that way. I think that's kind of the zenith of it, because in the end, that's what our Christian lives are all about, is surrendering to the will of God. Sometimes the will of God is not what we expect it to be, nor what we want it to be, but it is the will of God. And for Christians, it's our place to submit to the will of God. So first, I think we pray, God's will be done in the election. The other is in casting our votes. We have to balance that decision against our principles. And I remind Christians now of the greatest sermon ever preached, the Sermon on the Mount. So our value system should be found in those virtues, thinking about the poor, thinking about those who suffer loss, particularly in these days of a pandemic, thinking about those who are humble, those who thirst after righteousness, who really want to see right done, both in the temporal and the eternal. All right, we have those things. We have the two great commandments. When Jesus was asked of all the things God has ever said, what are the most important? He said they are two. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And the second is like it, or as I read it in the original Greek text of the New Testament, you could read that it is the equivalent to it. So the equivalent of it, to love your neighbor as yourself. So love factors very large here. St. Paul says the greatest of these is love. Now abide these, faith, hope, and love. The greatest of these is love. So love is a big factor here. For any evangelical, our core verse is John 3:16, for God so loved the world. Well, I'm going to quote a British voice because I came to my faith in Christ through the Methodist tradition, and John Wesley, the great British evangelist, one of the greatest of all time, is said to have said, although we can't find it in its entirety, but the quote can be found in fragments in several sermons of Wesley's. And he said, do all the good you can by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as you ever can. I have that on a plaque. You can see me reading it. It's right next to me because I just love it. And if we can evaluate our decisions based on these kinds of things, the great commandments, the virtues of the Sermon on the Mount, the admonition of Wesley and others, St. Paul, all of them, and then just ask, which candidate, which platform, which party better reflects these principles that we espouse? And for me, I had to make that decision. It was very difficult to do, but I came to the conclusion that in this instance, in this moment of time, another Bonhoefferian idea, it's what's now that matters, not then or there or into the future necessarily, but right in this moment, who better reflects that? I think it's Joe Biden and the Democratic Party here in the United States. They're not perfect, far from it, just as we all are, but we get a little closer to it than the Trump administration and the Republican Party as it stands right now. May not be true next time around, but I believe it's true now.